Hey dudes and dudettes, it's me, E.H. Ivins, and this is another edition of the Radical Reset. Today we're going to talk about waging the war on COVID. Now look, if polls are to be believed, and I think this last election has discredited polls to a large extent, if polls are to be believed, then the number one issue on the minds of most Americans is COVID, and I think that that's probably true. And I think it's true not because we're particularly worried about COVID, but because we're sick of the fucking shutdowns. Now, the way I see it, and let's just see if you agree with me, the population is divided basically down the middle. On the left side, and I'm picking that just because it's arbitrary, but it also lines up with liberalism, and Democrats, on the left side are the people that live in fear. We see them, the ones who drive in their car alone with a face mask on. People who come up to you and get in your face when you go into a store if you forgot to put up your gaiter or your face mask. People who pick on you for using a gaiter instead of a face mask. People who are basically have named themselves the COVID police, and the head of the COVID police is President-elect Joe Biden. Now, he basically is the, if not the personification, and I hate to use the word leader because he's so senile that I don't know that I would call him the leader, but he's certainly the figurehead spearheading the COVID plague group, the ones that, that won't open the schools because they're afraid of COVID, I don't know, rampaging through the teaching population. I'm not quite sure why the fuck that is, but we'll get into that in just a minute. On the other end of the spectrum are folks like me, those of us on the right or on the libertarian right, who believe that this is fucking insane. And, Donald Trump could have made the case, but he's such a pig, and he's not taken seriously, and no one listens to him. The thing about Donald Trump is, there are people you can disagree with, but you'll listen to them, and then there are people that you disagree with that the minute you hear their voice, you shut them off. So in my case, I'll give you a couple of examples. I watch fairly regularly Fox News Sunday with Chris Wallace. And the primary reason I watch the show isn't to listen to the pre-prepared talking points of Republicans and Democrats, but he usually has an excellent, balanced panel. Unlike the other Sunday morning shows like Meet the Press or George Stephanopoulos, who throw in a quote-unquote conservative, but they're kind of conservative lights. They're conservatives who are like country club conservatives, the ones who kind of go along with the Democrats, people like David Brooks, who I respect, but is not exactly a true conservative, because he'll accept a certain amount of government intervention and espouse or advocate for a certain amount of it given the situation. He's a conservative until it's inconvenient not to be a conservative, and then he'll go along to get along. And people like him, and I don't mean to pick on David Brooks, I actually have an enormous respect for him. I think he's a brilliant man, and that's a good example of a guy that I disagree with, but I'll listen to, because I'll watch him, for example, on, not NPR, on PBS. On the NewsHour, he does this piece with Mark Shields, who's a liberal Democrat, and they do this, point-counterpoint sort of thing. I forget what they call it on PBS, and I enjoy it. I don't necessarily, that's a good example of I can listen to them, because even when I disagree, they make their points in a way that I can hear it, I guess is the way to say it. I was no fan of Bill Clinton, but I can acknowledge that he did some good things. I was no fan of Jimmy Carter, but I can acknowledge he did some good things. And when I watch Fox News Sunday, back on point, there are people on his panel, like, for example, Donna Brazile, who was the chairman of the Al Gore campaign and is a liberal Democrat. But she is such a smart, measured, thoughtful liberal Democrat, and has at least one foot in the real world. I can listen to her, and even when I disagree, I don't hate her. I feel the same way about Juan Williams, is another example. Juan Williams is a very liberal Democrat, and I disagree with him, I would say, 9 times out of 10. But I can listen to him, and occasionally he'll make a point that if it doesn't change my mind, sometimes it will broaden my perspective. And listening to people who disagree with you, as long as you can hear them, is a good thing, because it does broaden your perspective, and at the very least gives you an understanding of what other people are thinking, because we're all not going to agree on anything. And when people say things like, the truth is, there is no truth, it's all just perspective. So I'll listen to another perspective if it's a thoughtful perspective. But then there are people like Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is such an asshole, ignoramus, misogynist, bully. And most of all, I'd say the adjective I'd use for Donald Trump is bully. He's such a bully, and he's such an ignorant bully, and he's such an unread bully, and he's such an incurious bully, and he's such a narcissistic bully that I can't really hear what he has to say. Even when he makes a good point, I have to wait till later till somebody else analyzes it, because I can't really hear it because I can't stand him. You know, and my brain does the involuntary turnoff. I just can't listen to another word he says. I have the same problem with Nancy Pelosi. I can't hear a word she says because she rubs me so completely the wrong way. She's so partisan. She's so unwilling to concede, you know, any point whatsoever. She's so unwilling to discuss. She just speaks in black and white partisan terms. I can't hear her. I just can't hear her. She doesn't speak from intelligence. She speaks from emotion. And the minute people go to emotion, and Donald Trump is a walking ball of emotion. You know, Trump and Pelosi are the same person. Just one's in a dress and one's in a suit. You know, you could switch them. You know, take their brains, leave the bodies alone, but switch them, and you'd barely get a difference. And I believe they're both so opportunistic and so enamored with the pursuit of power, you can't believe what they say. So that's the point I'm making. So anyway, let's turn the clock back. Let's get down to the point of war on COVID. I'm going to take a quick sip of water here. I'm getting a little dry. Okay, war on COVID. We have not fought this as a war. We have fought this as a defensive action. And as any good general or admiral will tell you, you cannot really successfully fight a defensive action. It's a constant process of retreat. You know, no obstacle or barrier created by man can stop nature. You know, in the end, you know, mountains can be crossed, barriers put on by men can be crossed. You know, there's just absolutely nothing that we can do to stop the onslaught of anything, virus or war, from a defensive position. All wars are won by offense. So way back when, we'll turn the clock back to March, and if you go back into March and take a look at an earlier podcast I made, it was basically, I think I even entitled it, I have to take a look, I think I entitled it Wait, or Wait and Think, Wait, Think. You know, my first piece of advice to everyone is, let's wait to see how things unfold. Why did I say that? First of all, because of the law of unintended consequences. Every time government takes action, it's taking action in democracy as we have set it up, a Republican democracy as we have today. It's all done based on polls and politics without any thought to long-term effects. So if the public demands something to be done, and remember, the public is demanding that from ignorance. In other words, when the public was shrieking, let's take care of COVID, they were doing it from ignorance, not stupidity. That's two different things. No one knew about COVID, not even the experts. So acting quickly to shut down and to basically destroy the economy was idiotic. It was unnecessary, and it was ill thought out, and it's going to have long-term repercussions. Now, the reason that we haven't seen those repercussions yet is because the government did a second thing without thinking, which is massive bailouts. And right now today, most of the public is, and I'm talking top to bottom, from the top of Wall Street to the bottom of, you know, guys being discharged from prison, everybody wants more stimulus. Everybody wants more stimulus to individuals. Everybody wants more stimulus to business. Everyone wants more stimulus. And the only argument is, how big is the stimulus? And it's, you know, you're living in the twilight zone when the Senate Senate Republicans are proposing $1.8 billion, and the House Democrats don't think that's enough. 1.8 trillion, I'm sorry. I can't even hardly go there. My mind won't go there. Trillion. A trillion is a million millions. It's 1,000 billions. It's an incredibly large number. And until Donald Trump, we never ran a $1 trillion deficit. But the last year before COVID, Trump had run a $1 trillion deficit. Donald Trump is going to prove to be a very mixed bag as president. He did some very good things, as I've acknowledged in prior podcasts, but the thing that's going to wreck us all is this debt spending that no one's thinking about. So let's turn the clock back. Let's talk about what I would have done in the war of COVID and what we should do in the war on COVID going forward, even though I know nobody's going to talk to me. But having said that, I want to talk to you from an anti-political position. And in other words, just to refresh those of you who might be new, antipolitism is democracy by a selection, not election. The people that represent us, and you can read about this, by the way, and I'll give you more details later in the book, The Radical Reset. This is the manifesto of antipolitism. So you can go into the details later and also watch earlier podcasts. I just did one reviewing antipolitism. Anyway, so antipolitism, we would get representatives who are not reading polls because they're never going to run for re-election. Since they're never going to run for re-election, they're going to do at least what they think is right, which the first step of reasonable people is to wait, okay? But we didn't do that, we acted. First, we wrecked the economy. We took a $23 trillion economy and wrecked it overnight. We overreacted, we shut everything down, we locked people in their homes before we had any idea of what the data would say. Now, what the early data said is, it turns out, was true even today. It turns out we were right about COVID to begin with. So let's get rid of some myths and let's talk about some truths of COVID. And what's going to, I need to have this discussion with you, because we can't just shout slogans at each other. We have to have a reason that we think the way we think. The first thing is, if you look up, and I put the link below in the description of this podcast, to the Center for Disease Control, the CDC, they have a very nice chart about deaths from COVID. There have been about 250,000 deaths from COVID in the United States. Guess how many deaths there have been of people under the age of 25. Okay, I'm not going to make you wait for long. Less than 500. In other words, out of 250,000 people, less than 500 have died, okay, as a result of COVID. Now, they may not even have died from the result of COVID. A lot of COVID deaths are being commingled with deaths from other causes. The primary risk factor in COVID, as it turns out, and we saw this early on and it's turned out to be true, is age. And then when you, in other words, I'm in a primary risk group for COVID. Then when you add, which thank God I don't have, other conditions like heart disease and diabetes, it becomes very threatening as an illness. So while the morbidity rate, which is the fancy way for saying how many people are going to die from COVID, is low, although it is 10 times the flu. Those of you who think that COVID is no more deadly than the flu have your head up your ass. COVID is 10 times more deadly than the flu, but it targets its deadliness on a very specific group of people. And it may not even be 10 times as deadly as the flu, because figures lie and liars figure, and statistics are manipulable. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, as part of the government stimulus, and this hasn't come out all the way yet, but it'll play out over time, the government is reimbursing higher to hospitals when the patient dies of COVID. In other words, the treatments that are ordered and the tests that are ordered and the reimbursements that are paid through Medicare and private insurance are higher for COVID than they are for the underlying illness. So let's say an old guy my age, I'm 63, so it's actually 65 and over, but that's an arbitrary start. Let's just say a guy my age, roughly, is a fatty and has adult onset diabetes, and it's very severe, and he's getting a lot of complications. He's, getting neuropathy in his feet and his hands and so on and so forth, and he's really sick. I mean, his diabetes is out of control. He's not properly watching it, or he can't control it, or whatever the case might be. There are those people with diabetes. It's a very serious illness. I know we see a lot of it and we tend to underplay it, but it's exceptionally serious illness, especially juvenile diabetes, people that have had it since they were children. Small digression, when I lived in Tucson years ago, the charity that I was the most active in was the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation. And the reason I was active in that is that next to Tucson is a Indian reservation, Native American reservation, for a tribe called the Navajo Autumn. We used to call them Navajos, but the proper name, their name, is Navajo Autumn. Now, the Navajos, the Navajo Autumn, historically, evolution equipped them to survive on very few calories. They were a desert-dwelling people. They didn't have widespread agriculture. They got most of their food through hunting. And, I live in a desert. I'm here to tell you there's a lot of wildlife, but it's not like living in a forest. And there's some agriculture, but we get very little rain. I mean, you can make a plan. Here in Arizona, where I live in Phoenix, and Phoenix is at 1,500 feet, and Tucson's at 2,500 feet, so it's a little bit cooler. But the climates are about the same. And I can tell you for a fact that the great thing about living in Arizona is you can plan, for example, a wedding in April today, and it's going to be a sunny day. I mean, it's even the April showers don't really happen, not in Arizona. So you can, it's always a nice day. We get about 350 plus days of sunshine a year, but that's going to limit how much agriculture there is. So anyway, back to the Navajo Autumn, they didn't eat very many calories. They subsisted on very little, and so they evolved that way. And they didn't need that many calories to live. Well, in comes the white man, and in comes supermarkets, and the next thing you know, they're all fat. So if you went down to the Navajo Autumn Reservation today, you would find that obesity is an enormous problem among those people, and particularly childhood obesity, which then leads to childhood juvenile diabetes, which is a huge, huge problem and ends up, really devastating. And You know, it's not like all these people are Mary Tyler Moore. Mary Tyler Moore had juvenile diabetes, but managed to live, you know, until old age because she carefully policed and took care of herself. But these aren't wealthy people and stars who have people to make sure they do everything right. And a lot of times they don't properly control it, and it ends up in all kinds of health complications. Now, I share all this with you because on that reservation there have been a higher incidence of deaths due to COVID. I mean, this is one of the things Joe Biden's talking about, is the higher incidence of COVID mortality among minorities. Well, there's a reason for that. The reason is they don't take as good care of themselves, and they tend more towards obesity. They tend to eat much more starch and calorically heavy diets, and they tend to be fat, and fat leads to diabetes, and diabetes leads to a risk when you get COVID, and then you die. Okay, now, I point all this out because in the 250,000 deaths that are being recorded due to COVID, we don't know the answer to this, but it is a reasonable question and not a nutty question to ask how many would have died anyway. Okay, and it's a safe assumption that at least half of those people were on their way out anyway. In other words, their deaths might have been attributable to COVID, but they were going to be dead in the next year anyway. Now, let's take another step back. In the United States, there are approximately 340 million people. Now, for those of you, and this is very basic math, and forgive me those of you who are quick with math, but just so that everyone understands what we're talking about, because, you know, figures lie in liar's figures, I said, and you can really scare people with numbers until they gain perspective. So, 1% of 340 million is 3.4 million, because 100 times 3.4 million equals 340 million, so it's 1%. A percent is per 100, okay? Everyone gets that. I know I'm being simplistic, math guys, but I just want to make sure everyone follows me. Now, because not all of us love math, and so not all of us have looked at it since elementary school, so that's just all the reason I'm going through this. Now, a tenth of 1%, therefore, would be 340,000. So if we have in fact had 250,000 COVID-related deaths in the United States, we have had less than a tenth 1%. About 0.7% have died as a result of COVID since the outbreak of the virus here in the United States. Now the question has to be asked, and no one's asking it because it's so politically incorrect, but must be asked, how many of those people would have been dead anyway? And the true answer is at least half and maybe more, including the ones under 25. So when you look at it that way, if you figure there's only been about 100,000 or so actual COVID deaths out of 340 million, which is something like 0.3%, this is nothing to freak the fuck out over. So what we did in shutting down the economy is cause enormous damage and deaths in ways, and other deaths in ways that we cannot really accurately count. There's just no way to do that. For example, suicides. Now it's impossible to ask a suicide, why did you commit suicide? Unless they leave a note, and only in movies do they only leave notes. Do they always leave notes? A lot of times they don't leave notes. And even if they leave a note, that doesn't mean that's necessarily the reason. We're dealing with somebody with severe mental illness to kill themselves, right? So the bottom line is, how many suicides, there has been undeniably an increase in suicides, how many of those suicides are as a result of the isolation of COVID? A lot. How many? We don't know. And I'm not going to pretend, you know, what the press would do is make up some bullshit number that would take on a life of its own. You know, it's like, I don't know if you remember years ago, there was statistics that wife beatings went up during the Super Bowl, and they cited some statistic like there are 87,000 wife beatings during the Super Bowl game every year. It's not true. They made it up out, but it got bandied around, you know, by the mainstream media. You'd think you'd believe it. Or, you know, it's a statistic that a woman over 40 will never get laid again. That's not true. But, you know, it got printed by Cosmo or some bullshit, you know, and the next thing you know, it seemed like truth, and then it got, you know, parroted around by everybody who wanted to believe it, and the next thing you know, it takes on a life of its own. But don't confuse bullshit statistics with reality, and double check things before you believe them. And the beautiful thing is with Google, you know, and similar search engines, we have at our fingertips the information of the world. You don't have to just believe the shit. So when I tell you there have been 250,000 COVID-related deaths and less than 500 people under the age of 25, I get that from the Center of Disease CDC. Disease control. I'm losing my mind. I swear to God, it's Alzheimer's disease setting up. Joe, I understand how you feel. Anyway, the bottom line is it's a real statistic, but how it breaks down, no one knows. So the point of that is, in line with what I'm talking about today, is how do you fight a war when you don't know your enemy? You don't know how dangerous he is. You don't know what his biggest guns do. You don't know how, you know, what's going on with him. All you're doing is blindly attacking, and that will lead to unforeseen consequences. Only in this case, they're easily foreseen, and the consequence is going to be economic collapse, okay? Why? Because we're printing up trillions and trillions of dollars with nothing behind them, okay? Nothing but the full faith and credit of the U.S. government. Now, this is where you got to gain a little perspective. The United States, after World War II, in 1948, in a place called Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, entered into something with the rest of the world's powers called the Bretton Woods Agreement, given the location of when it was signed. And basically, it was that the US dollar would back up all other world currencies, and the dollar would be backed by gold and silver that is stored in Fort Knox, Kentucky, which, by the way, is still there. Now, having said that, the problem with the gold standard, if you're a politician, there's no problem with it if you're a private individual. It's the only standard that makes any sense in the valuation of money and as a check on government spending. But politicians figured out how to beat that, and the politician that really fucked it all up was none other than Richard Nixon, who in 1971 abrogated the Bretton Woods Agreement, fancy word for canceled it, like Donald Trump walked out of the Paris Climate Accords, which, by the way, I agree with. I just don't use that as an example of unilateral abrogation, or walked away from the incredibly stupid Iran treaty, which was a correct move on his part. The point is, that's what abrogation means. So Richard Nixon did that unilaterally in 1971. He did that because he wanted to fight the Vietnam War and continue Lyndon Johnson's Great Society social programs at the same time, and we didn't have enough money to do both. So traditionally, where governments in the old days, when we were under the gold standard, would have to make a choice between guns or butter. In other words, we could fight a war or we could have social programs, but you can't do both. Since 1971, we've been doing both. We've had an unending stream of wars, some of them quite major, trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars expended, and we've also been printing up dollars to cover it and have created this enormous national debt of fiat currency. Now, our dollar still backs up all the other world currencies. We back up the euro, we back up the yuan, we back up the yen, we back up everything. I could go down, I'm not going to sit there and go into a recitation of the world's currencies, but we back it all up. So if the dollar goes, they all go. And they're all on fiat currency because politicians around the world have all learned that the greatest way to keep power is to give people free shit they don't pay for. And if you run out of money, you can't give them their free shit that they don't pay for. So what's the best way to do that? Print up bullshit money to buy free shit, to give it up to the parasites who will accept it. And, you know, I know that's all hard, what I just said, but it's the truth, okay? Bullshit money to buy free shit to give to parasites. That's what the government does. And it does it in a massive scale. And now, as a result of COVID, we've created an economy that's essentially parasitic to the government. We've fulfilled the dreams of the socialists and of the governmental types. We've put ourselves in a position where the only way out of this disaster, there are only two ways out of this economic disaster we're in, if you believe the mainstream. Okay, one would be to allow total collapse to take place and not come to the table with some kind of stimulus. And the other way would be to issue stimulus checks and more programs, and more PPPs and all those other things that we've been doing, and bailing out industries like the airlines and so on and so forth. And, you know, they're going to probably do something for the restaurant industry and basically try to bail out the whole fucking economy. Now, the problem is that's the wrong way. You know, raising children, one of the most basic lessons I taught my children, which applies not just in your individual life, but in the national life as well, is that the hard decision and the right decision are always the same thing. When faced with multiple choices, if you look at what is the hardest course of action, that will almost certainly be the correct course of action. The easy way is always the way that has unintended consequences you never considered. It's how I ended up in prison. If I would have declared bankruptcy at the time of the crash of 2008 of the company that I tried to save, I would have spared myself prison. Even though I still would have hurt a lot of people, it wouldn't have crossed into criminality. But because I saw an ability to raise more money to try to bail it out, and I believed my own bullshit, the next thing I knew, I found my tuchus in prison, okay? That's when I took the easy way. I didn't learn my own lesson. So, consequently, and we all do that, we're all hypocrites, right? We know the right thing to do, but we just don't do it. And we're doing it writ large in COVID, because here we are in a situation where we're in a pandemic, we've destroyed the economy. We should have never done that to begin with, because COVID is not all that deadly to the healthy. And as a result of doing that, now we're faced with the quandary of either bail ourselves out some more, or allow a depression to take place. And I'm here to tell you, The correct course of action is allow the depression to take place. We have got to clean the decks, but we're not going to do that. That's not what's going to happen. What we're going to do is make it a depression into a Great Depression, and we're going to do that by continuing this idiotic policy of bailouts, which sooner or later will reach the point of the straw breaking the camel's back. Let me explain. Why do you believe that a dollar is a dollar? In other words, if you owned a store and a guy walked in and bought, I don't know, a pack of gum, does that cost $1 now? I don't even fucking know because I don't chew gum. But let's pretend. Let's say that you own a convenience store, a guy walks in and he buys a pack of gum and he hands you a dollar bill. Why do you accept the dollar bill? Because you believe that the dollar represents value equal to what you're selling the pack of gum for. Okay? That's true of all pricing. The free market says price, but underlying it is money, and money is the foundation on which the free economy sits. And if money, as long as money has value, then price can be determined. Because that's all an economy is a giant pricing mechanism, and pricing determines availability. So, to make a long story short, we all believe the dollar's a dollar, and as long as we continue to believe the dollar's a dollar, it will be a dollar. But what happens if we stop believing? What if something happens, some event, and it's unforeseen? You know, if you're going to ask me what event, I don't know. It'll be unforeseen. No one's going to know it until it happens. I'm not prescient. I'm making a prediction that will come true, but I'm not picking the day it's going to come true because there's no way for me to possibly know what the event will be that kicks it off. It could be a war. It could be a natural disaster. It could be an asteroid strike. Who the fuck knows? But something will happen, okay? As sure as God made little green apples, because history has not come to an end, something is going to happen, something negative, because they just do. It's built into the system, and there's going to be a loss of confidence in the dollar. That will start a cascading effect that will cause a loss of confidence in all global currencies and a worldwide depression so deep and so terrible that the last depression will seem like a happy memory to those people old enough to remember it, or those of us who read books and understand what made it up. What caused that depression is very different from what's going to cause this one. This is going to be more than a depression. This is going to be a total economic collapse. This is going to be the event of the 21st century. It's going to be our 21st century equivalent of World War I, World War II, and the Great Depression combined. And it's all going to be brought on by COVID and the reaction. And COVID isn't bringing it. We've been printing money since 1971. COVID is the straw that's breaking the camel's back. And the question is, what event will kick off the realization that we have now printed and will continue to print trillions of dollars out of thin air? The Federal Reserve prints the money, the Treasury Department borrows it, the government spends it, and then when the note comes due, they borrow more money to pay that note, plus the interest, plus more money to pay the continuing benefits. In tax revenue, we're only collecting half of what we need, okay? And that's when we don't have COVID. With COVID, we're not even collecting 20%, okay? And so we're just printing this shit out of thin fucking air. And this is going to come back to haunt us for sure. Now, what should we have done? And what should we do in future pandemics or future crises that come up? What would the proper course of action to be? The proper course of action, what an anti-political president would have done, a president that wasn't worried about what polls said and could tell the truth, he or she would have said this: we're facing a pandemic. Thank God we already know two things. And we knew this, by the way, back in March. We know that it doesn't kill children, thank God. And we know that it primarily targets sick old people. Okay, now, in other words, people already on their way out. There's no other way to say that. These are people that are going to be dead anyway, okay? Now, I mean, I recognize, as much as I don't want to recognize, I recognize that I'm in the last lap of my life. I mean, it's just the way it is. You just got to accept that telling people something that's true shouldn't hurt anyone's feelings. In 63 years old, I'd like to live, as long as I'm healthy and my brain works. But the day that no longer is true, goodbye. That's just the way life is. That is the circle of life, Hakuna Matata. That's just the way it works. So anyway, what would I have done? I'd have said, look, let's pretend I'm addressing the American people and I'm an anti-political president. I would have said, look, here's the deal. Here's this pandemic that's worldwide, but we're not going to do what every other country's doing. We're not going to shut down because we understand the nature of the illness is it's going to leave almost everybody else alone except the very old. Oh, you might get sick, but your sickness will either be asymptomatic or mild unless you are old and have major risk categories. almost without exception. And the few exceptions that there are not enough to destroy the country over. And this is where I say it's like a war. When a general goes into a battle, let's say that you're a general and you're going to take, let me use an historical perspective. Let's take the Battle of the Bulge, World War II. Okay, the 101st Airborne is trapped in Bastogne. The Americans, General Patton breaks off the attack he has in southern Germany, turns his army and heads north to relieve Bastogne and the 101st Airborne. In the course of doing that, he took significant casualties. But like any general, he said to himself, here's what I'm going to achieve, here's what I'm going to expend. Now, what would have happened if the Germans had been winning the war and the 101st Airborne had been isolated in Bastogne, and it would have cost, 100,000 men to relieve 10,000 men? Would we have done it? And probably not. And I'll give you an example of where we didn't do it. The Philippines in World War II. The Philippines were a U.S. possession until 1948. We gave Philippines its independence in 1948. We won the Philippines from the Spanish during the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century. Now, that's just so you have some historical perspective. General MacArthur was in the Philippines. He was the Field Marshal of the Philippines Armed Forces, believe it or not, as well as an American general. And he had troops at his command, but not enough to defend against the Japanese Empire, who invaded. Now, this was subsequent to Pearl Harbor. Our fleet was lying mostly in ruins. We didn't have the manpower to relieve the Philippines, and even though it meant tens of thousands of Americans going into Japanese prison camps, a horror show, a horror story. By the way, just as a side note, I just wrote a terrific book that I'm going to recommend to you, and I'm not off subject. It's called The Indomitable Florence Smith. It's a wonderful book. It's newly out. I just picked it up because I saw a review of it, I think a national review. It's the story of a Filipina-American woman, a daughter of an American serviceman who came to the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, and a Philippine woman who grew up in the Philippines and became a tremendous hero in World War II by, well, I'll let you read the book. She risked her life, and it's a fantastic book. Let me just say that at the end I was crying. Okay, and that doesn't mean it has a bad ending, but it's about war, so it just is. A lot of the characters die because we're talking reality, real World War II, real Japanese internment camps. But I bring that all up because we didn't relieve the Philippines. The Philippines fell. Tens of thousands of men went into imprisonment. Most of them died in imprisonment, but it was a loss that Admiral Nimitz, who was the head of the Pacific Fleet, and General Marshall, who was the chief of staff, and President Roosevelt made the decision that they let the Philippines go because of the cost that would have involved trying to save the Philippines at that time. Now, fast forward later, 1944, we went back into or 1945, we went back into the Philippines, and we took it because we were in such a powerful position that at that point, our casualties would not have exceeded the benefit that we realized by retaking the Philippines, and it was the right thing to do because they trusted and relied on us. And that's the famous thing where General MacArthur, waves ashore and says, "I have returned." He gave the speech, "I shall return," and then he did return. And anyway, I don't want to digress into World War II history. But the point is, back to COVID, that would have been the correct course of events. To say to people, look, the cost of shutting down our economy to try to contain COVID, which clearly, by the way, history has shown already, can't be contained. It's going to do what it's going to do. I mean, you can mitigate it, but you can't really contain it. We're already having surges again, despite everything, and you can blame it on kids going back to school. But you know what the infection rate is of children, by the way? 0.17% get it, are testing positive. 0.1, and by the way, of that 0.17%, almost all of them are asymptomatic. They test positive, but they never showed a symptom because COVID is so mild. Again, less than 500 people have died of COVID in the United States under the age of 25. That includes all children. Less than 500, and most of those are. We could open up K through 12 right now, and the risk of those children is zero, and the risk to the teachers is virtually zero, 0.17%. Come on, man. I mean, talk about an overreaction. And this is typical of what went on. We overreacted to everything. So I would have said to the people, we're not going to shut down. We're going to keep America open. Let the whole world shut down. We're staying open. Our business is staying open, our factories are staying open, our farmers are farming, our supply chain will not be disrupted. We will not disrupt the toilet paper supply. We will not disrupt the food supply. We will simply isolate those populations as best we can that are most significantly at risk. We will work extremely hard to develop a vaccine, which we have done. That was the correct course of action, done by private industry, by the way, not the government. Now, I know Donald Trump is going to talk about Operation Warp Speed. Warp Speed simply is guaranteeing distribution to Pfizer, for example. It didn't pay for the research, okay? Yeah, it's great, but it's being done by private industry. What a surprise, since government invents nothing. And in partnership with private industry, that's how it should be distributed. This idea of having the military distribute COVID is insane. It should be done in partnership. That should be done in private industry as well. In other words, CVS, Walgreens, it wouldn't be a big trick to distribute the vaccine throughout the population through private sources and let people, pardon me, that was me bumping the camera, and let people privately go to these places and get it done. And, we don't need, sorry, that's me again. It's a myth that we need 100% of the people to take the vaccine. About 40% of the people taking the vaccine will effectively create herd immunity for the entire population, given who's already been affected and already immune naturally and so on and so forth. That's about it. So as long as 4 out of 10 people go down and take the vaccine from Walgreens or CVS, that'll do the job. But the point is, we never had to shut down the economy, but we would have to have accepted, someone would have had to have told the truth that we were going to lose 250,000 people. But then the other side of the truth is they were mostly going to die anyway, and you have to make a value judgment. Is it worth destroying the American system and culture, which is what's coming, okay, to control an illness that almost killed nobody that wasn't going to die anyway? And the answer is it was never worth it. So I'm going to take an extreme position here. We should absolutely, positively, neither lock down nor mandate nor control the average person. We should isolate sick old people. And by the way, most of those that are going to die have already died. What you're going to see now is, and you're seeing it already, the infection rate is very high right now. It's at its all-time high, but the morbidity rate, those dying, is very low because there's 2 reasons for that. One is they've developed some very good palliative treatments. Fancy word for like taking an aspirin, right? They've developed treatments that shorten and lessen the symptoms of COVID, like taking aspirin for a bad fever. A fever can kill you, but if you take aspirin, it won't. Or Tylenol, I don't practice medicine, but there are lots of palliative treatments for severe fever. We've developed those things for COVID as well, and so the death rate has gone way down. Plus, most of the people that were going to die of it have already died. Consequently, the death rate is very, very low and will continue to get lower as, again, palliative treatments improve, and those that were going to die, eventually, all of them that were going to die are going to die off. And this relative, back to my discussion of percentages, it's not that many people, okay? It's no more than would have died anyway. We'll never know the real statistic, but how many of those 250,000 people who died of COVID died really of other things, were classified as COVID because of higher reimbursements by insurance companies and the government, and are mudding up the statistics? We'll never know. We'll never know because no bureaucrat's ever going to admit it, and no hospital chain is ever going to admit it, and no doctor's ever going to admit it. But we have distorted statistics that we can't rely on. But what we know, even from the distorted statistics, is that COVID really isn't dangerous enough to have destroyed our entire economy over. And now we're about to print up another $3 or $4 trillion of bullshit for more bailouts, and we're stuck. We're stuck at 0 interest rates, which means the Federal Reserve has no ammunition. We're printing money ad infinitum, and ultimately this is going to result in a hyperinflation and a monetary collapse. Yeah, I know modern monetary theory. It's modern monetary bullshit. The most wrong economist in America, Paul Krugman, a man who's made a career of being wrong, but he's so wrong on the left that the left loves him, is saying that it doesn't matter. That's how you know it matters. Okay, if Paul Krugman says it doesn't matter, it matters. Okay, he is almost miraculously inept. Okay, and I leave you to do your own research. You'll be able to see how right that is. He's an ideologue. He's an ideologue disguised as an economist. I'm going to drink some more water. So let's wrap this up. Here's where we are. President Biden is going to. Now what he's saying is he's going to have regional lockdowns, basically. It's all bullshit, man. And the Republicans in the Senate, who are nothing more than Democrats lighter, they're going to come to a compromise bill of a couple of $1 trillion, and then they'll sneak in trillions more. There'll be trillions and trillions and trillions. And now we're starting to talk about trillions the way we used to talk about billions, which is what inflation does, by the way. It makes money seem like it's worth less because that's what inflation is. And we're going to destroy everything. It's coming, my friends. It's coming like a freight train down the track. And you must protect yourself. Move some of your investments into cryptocurrencies, gold and silver, because if you don't, and if you have no savings, let me be the first to tell you the truth. You're fucked. I don't know any other way to say it. I'm not a politician. I'm going to tell you the truth. You need to right now, because the one thing I don't know is whether the collapse will come tomorrow, a year from now, or 5 years from now. But in historical terms, and that's the point I was making. I'm sorry, I jumped away from it earlier. Yeah, we went off the gold standard in 1971, and the modern monetary theorists would say, look, we've been going, for 49 years, almost 50 years, and no currency collapse, and it's all worked out. In historical terms, 50 years is nothing. It's nothing. It's a blink of the eye. This chicken is coming home to roost. I hate, it's coming. It's coming. It's coming. It's coming. It's coming. It's coming. The disaster is coming. We didn't fight COVID like a war. We fought it like a bunch of idiot pussies, and we threw money at it, and we're going to get exactly what we paid for, which is disaster. Okay? We should have just said, some people are going to die. Most people are going to live. We're just going to live with it like every other illness. Okay? And we could have still hustled towards a vaccine, which is the only exit strategy from COVID. All the other ones are bullshit. It's kind of like global warming. They talk about, windmills and sun farms. It's all bullshit. Those things are too diffuse and too intermittent. The only answer to global warming is nuclear power. Period. It's a technological answer. And the only answer to COVID is the vaccine. And everything else is bullshit. And destroying the economy and isolating people and causing suicides and depression and God only knows what else that we cannot possibly quantify because it's impossible to statistically research this in any meaningful way. But use your common sense. The treatment is worse than the illness. The disease itself is next to nothing. Again, they were going to die anyway. These people were going to die anyway. I'm not telling you this because I'm some kind of idiot psychopath that enjoys the death of people. I'm sad about that. And I hope that we learn to treat diabetes and heart disease and learn to minimize those things. But, until we do, and we are learning more about it all the time. We are learning how to treat diabetes and heart disease. But until they're cured, then when something like this comes along, it's going to kill those people. I'm sorry. But an awful lot of those people are in the position they're in, and let's again, this is going to be cold, this is something a politician would never say, they have diabetes, particularly adult onset, and they have heart disease because of lifestyle choices they made that they knew were bad to begin with. You turn it, most diabetics, if you walked into a room full of diabetics, and again, you're talking to a guy that worked with juvenile diabetes, but it's true there as well, they're mostly very, very fat. But unlike the Navajo Autumn, it isn't for evolutionary reasons that they can't eat a normal amount of calories and not get fat. It's because they're gluttonous. And gluttonous people get heart disease, and that's the way it goes. You pays your money, you takes your chances. But the other part of that story is they know that going in. They just prefer to eat a lot for whatever. It might be emotional reasons, or they may just enjoy food. I'm not here to make a value judgment. But should we shut down and destroy the country because a bunch of fatties died during COVID? They were going to die anyway. Same thing is true with, smoking is another huge risk factor for heart disease. Now, every smoker knows it's going to kill them. They know it. They're not fucking stupid. They make a value judgment. Their value judgment is they'd rather take the risk of dying young than go without cigarettes. Okay. That's an adult decision. If that's the decision you make, fine. As long as you don't blow it in my face, I don't give a fuck what you do. But again, do we destroy the economy because a bunch of smokers gave themselves heart disease and are dying of COVID? The whole thing, we're not looking at this the right way. We're not approaching this as a war. We're approaching this as a bunch of idiots. Okay? Let's stop playing defense this isn't the bubonic plague. This isn't Ebola. Thank God. If we were dealing with the bubonic plague or Ebola, then I would have a very different. You can't, because it's a pandemic, you can't lump it together with other. This is a very mild pandemic. It's like saying the common cold is a pandemic. Only on steroids. Yes, it's more deadly than the flu, but again, only if the risk factors are present. What the fuck? What the fuck? Now, if we had an anti-political government, if we had a government of people that were not heading up for election, who didn't have to pander to lies, who didn't have to... Look, it's not that they're not going to care about what polls say and what people want, but when people want something that's really stupid and they have a bunch of information that's contrary, and since they're not going to run for re-election, they'll take the time to sit down and explain why people have it wrong. Okay, just like I did with you today. All right, now if you were open to it, now of course the case in a podcast like this is the people watching me are probably people that already agree with me, right? You probably already agree with me 9 times out of 10. But if I were an anti-political congressman or senator or president, I'd be able to sit down and explain it to you. And if you didn't like it, I would think, oh, well, they didn't like it, but the truth is the truth because I can't be reelected. I can't run for reelection. I'm not going to pander. I'm going to tell, because I have the information. I'm not going to reason from ignorance. Okay? The one thing about being in the Congress will be, they'll have access to all the latest information, and so they'll make a reasonable judgment. But what we have today are people that have all the latest information and are ignoring it, and instead are pandering to the fears of people because it gets them reelected. And they're spending money we don't have because it gets them reelected. And they're going to destroy our country because it's more important to them to be reelected and maintain their power than to do the right thing for the country. And that is why we've got to throw them out, and we must all become anti-politists. And that's where I'm going to leave it today. Now, again, I'll bring this up again. This is the Manifesto of Antipolitism. It's called A Radical Reset. It is available to you on Amazon. You can either get the hard copy like this one, and it's not that thick. You can read it through. We're not talking War and Peace here. And it spells out everything about antipolitism in detail. Or you can download it to your electronic reading device, Kindle or something similar, Nook, yada yada. Or if you are a Prime member, you can borrow it for free from the Kindle Lending Library. Now, regardless of how you pick up A Radical Reset, I get paid every time you turn the page, even if you borrow it for free. That helps support this podcast. It helps support Antipolitism. And unlike sending you to a Patreon page where I'm just asking you to contribute, you get something, which is the manifesto. Not only is it, by the way, interesting, I think it's funny and fun to read. So, where's it written down that you can't be funny while you're explaining things? I don't. To me, you got to keep it a little bit light, because if you don't, it gets a little too morbid. I don't know. I have a hard time reading doom and gloom books because they all get a little too morbid. I'm talking doom and gloom, but I have a sense of humor about it, which I know seems like an unreasonable dichotomy, but it really isn't. Read it in context. Pick up your copy of A Radical Reset. Right above my head, it says, text Antipolitism to 844-935-0444. That is to get involved in Antipolitism. Since we are in the very basic stage of Antipolitism, what I'm doing now is building the base. Now, starting this weekend, we're going to take Antipolitism on the street. We is myself and my producer, Eric. And we're going to take this camera on the road and go out into places and talk to people on the street to broaden the base of Antipolitism. Number one, because it'll be interesting, and everyone loves the man on the street stuff, and it'll be like watching, you got to do your own act. I'm not going to do somebody else's act, but a little combination of Jay Leno, Jesse Waters, and me. A little combination of man on the street stuff to discuss antipolitism with people and introduce them and field their political ideas and talk about, it'll be fun. I don't know where it'll go, but it'll be fun. It'll be live, it'll be unscripted, and we're going to start recording those this weekend. They'll start showing up in the next couple of weeks. Now, the other thing that does is that it gets those people who are appearing to tie in their social media when they appear on the podcast, which will broaden the audience, because my own social media is very limited. Having been in prison, I only have a few hundred friends. Consequently, that's why my audience is so limited. And in order to get this picked up into the search engine, YouTube is a search engine. We need to broaden its base, and that's how we're going to do it. But as people get involved, listen to it and believe it, I need some of you to really get on fire about it and to join and get active. The next step after going public with it, and I'm hoping this is going to be sometime towards the middle of next year to the end of next year, is I'm going to take Antipolitism on the road and travel the country speaking to university groups, social clubs, civic clubs, organizations, political groups, you name it, of every stripe, right and left, across the country, spreading the gospel of antipolitism. Because as radical as antipolitism is, it will become reasonable when the shit hits the fan. It'll become the only true alternative, because the only alternative now is socialism, and we know that doesn't work. All that is the empowerment of envy, and that just simply doesn't work. So we need a new ism, and we're not going to go to fascism, and we're going to destroy our democracy the way we're doing it. So we need a new democratic form that will fix what was wrong with the old one. Things like spending $100 million in the state of Montana for a senatorial election and a job that pays $175,000 a year. That's corrupt on its face. But because these idiots write the laws, they make corruption legal, and we must throw them out. They have fucked up our country with their shallow shit and not taking the time to educate. The American people are smart, and they will listen, and they will come around. But the problem is, in the current system, we get no leadership willing to take the time to explain, because it's so much easier to retain your power by pandering to ignorance. And that has to stop, and that's what antipolitism does. Okay, before you go, if you haven't done it already, click the subscriber button, click notification, click share, and share this with as many of your friends as you possibly can, because I think they'll find it interesting. And that's it for today. Thank you so very, very much for joining me. And until next time, this is E.H. Ivins saying so long.